Okay, well, good morning again. Good to see everybody. Today we continue our study of Paul's letter to the Philippians, which we began last time we met 2 weeks ago. So I don't plan to spend a lot of time each week reviewing what we previously covered. And so as just a friendly reminder, and you know what I'm going to say, if you missed a Sunday, please take advantage of the website or any number of podcast services so that you can be brought up to speed each time. We covered quite a bit of background material last week, but one thing that we did not give a lot of attention to was the occasion itself, the actual situation that prompted Paul to write this letter. We talked about the letter's overall purpose, but not the specific circumstances behind it. So let's just begin with that for today. The letter actually lays this all out for us. Paul refers to a man named Epaphroditus, a servant there at the church in Philippi, who had been sent to Paul to provide him support and encouragement during his time of incarceration. And we could assume that this visit included something like a care package from the Philippian church. Epaphroditus brought with him various supplies along with a financial gift, and he too was part of that care package, if you will. He was sent there by the Philippian church to encourage Paul, come along his side, and serve him in any way that he could. And in this visit, Paul is able to find out how the church is doing and all that is going on back in Philippi, he is very eager to learn about all that. And in return, the Philippians are eager to hear how Paul is doing. And so Epaphroditus is to bring back a report. So this is pretty much the occasion here. Paul prepares a letter for this purpose to be read to the whole church there. He uses the opportunity to express several things. He is, of course, being held in confinement, awaiting trial, and so he fills them in about how all that is going. In fact, there have been some opportunities for evangelism that he is eager to tell them about. He also wants to express his gratitude to God for their gifts and prayers, tell them how much he has benefited from their support. And given the promise of Christ's return, he encourages them to endure persecution, which they're starting to feel, and to be joyful in all circumstances. He goes on to warn them about false teachers who are promoting legalism, a false gospel, and he exhorts them to pursue humility and unity, and singles out two prominent women in that church who were in some sort of squabble with each other. And he tells them that once he knows the outcome of his impending trial, he will send Timothy to them with the news, and that he himself hopes to pay them another visit at some point. And he expresses his appreciation for Epaphroditus and encourages them to appreciate him for the servant that he is. Paul affectionately refers to him as a brother, a co-worker, and a fellow soldier. And he also notes that Epaphroditus had been ill during this visit, and in fact, he had almost died. So as you can see, there's not one particular reason for the letter, but several. He had a variety of things he wanted to tell them, and this visit of Epaphroditus provided an opportunity to pass all that on to them. And that in particular is what prompted the writing of this letter. It is time for Epaphroditus to return home and to bring back to the church this important letter from Paul. Now, unlike many of his other letters, this one is not preoccupied with addressing problems. Only a couple are mentioned, and then only briefly. There are no great heresies to contend with. There's no major corrections on how they're doing things. No weighty concerns about in-house factions. Certainly no scolding of any kind. You may remember that the letter functions much in the same way as a missionary support letter that is common today. You know, here's what is going on. Here are some things you can be praying about, and thank you for your support. Another matter that we did not talk about last Sunday is the structure of the letter itself, tracking Paul's overall flow of thought. Because this letter is more personal and informal and not highly instructional, it is not really tightly organized, which is common with letters between friends. In some of his other letters, Paul will start with theology in the first half and then turn his focus to application in the second half. But here in Philippians, he kind of mingles theology and application together. And so if you were to consult, say, 10 different commentaries or Bible handbooks looking for an outline, well, you'd probably come up with 10 different ones. And some would not even try. And that's not because the letter is a disorganized mess. It isn't. Again, it is, as discussed last week, a friendship letter. It is personal correspondence, not to be read as a thesis or a chapter in a textbook. That said, we could loosely suggest 4 primary sections just to kind of keep things simple, and these more or less follow the chapter divisions, more or less. So if you have your Bibles, you might want to just kind of follow along as we work through this. In chapter 1, he explains his situation there at Rome, and not knowing the outcome of it, he simply tells his readers that whatever happens, his goal is that Christ would be glorified. In chapter 2, he exhorts them to conduct themselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, namely to endure hardship and persecution and strive for brotherly love and unity. And this he does by reminding them of the example of Christ. If they were to adopt their Savior's humility and obedience, then they will become blameless and pure, true children of God. And he makes note that there are 2 men who serve as examples of Christ-like servants, and that they should be appreciated and honored as such, and he names them as Timothy and Epaphroditus. In chapter 3, Paul warns the church to be alert to certain Jewish legalists who will try to distract them from the faith by forcing circumcision and other religious rituals. Paul counters this with a vigorous and persuasive teaching about justification by faith, and goes on to show that he had once trusted in external forms of legalism and found it all to be rubbish. In the last section, chapter 4, Paul concludes with some final exhortations, mostly dealing with finding peace in God and rejoicing in God's goodness. He again refers to them as fellow partners in the spread of the gospel, which is intended to encourage them and help them see the larger value of their gifts and prayers. So this morning, we're going to be covering the second part of chapter 1, picking up where we left off last time. We'll be starting with verse 12. It's a rather lengthy section, but we should be able to move through it pretty easily. The heading is found in the NIV, says, Paul's chains advance the gospel, and that really is a good way to capture those 19 verses. And as we read it, we will come across 2 of the 4 opponents of either Paul or of the gospel that are mentioned in the letter. And so before we dive in, a few comments are in order about those before we start here. So in verses 15 through 17, here in our section today, we find certain preachers who are trying to stir up trouble for Paul. We don't really know anything about them or what they are up to, but according to Paul, they preach out of envy, rivalry, selfish ambition, and they are divisive. Their motives, he says, are false. They oppose him personally, but he does acknowledge that what they preach, well, Paul actually agrees with. In fact, he's glad for their preaching. In verses 28 through 30, again in our section today, we find another set of opponents. Paul mentions those who are trying to intimidate the Christians there in Philippi, causing them no small degree of suffering. And most likely, we don't know, but most likely these are Roman authorities or Roman citizens who, for whatever reason, are wanting to silence the gospel and will use the threat of force to do so. And then later in chapter 3, we have some form of Judaizers, those who insist that Christians follow Jewish rituals, especially circumcision. Paul is especially agitated with them, for what they teach is a direct attack upon the cross, upon the core teaching of salvation by faith, and what they promote minimizes the efficacy of Christ's atonement. And these Judaizers get access to the churches because they claim to be Christians, and it looks like they're trying to worm their way into this church here at Philippi. And then later in chapter 3, we have those who have given in to the pressures of their culture, and they live as enemies of the cross. It appears that they profess to be Christians, but their minds are on earthly things. Their God is not the Lord above, but rather their own selfish appetites. They are enemies of the cross because their lives contradict the true message of the cross. So once we plug these various opponents and enemies into what we already know about Paul's relationship with this church and the reasons for this letter, we get a fuller picture of what's going on there and some of his concerns. But again, none of these threats appear to me, at least at this point, to be too serious, but yet serious enough to warrant some attention. Okay, so let's go ahead and read through today's passage. We'll start there at verse 12. My translation, again, might be slightly worded differently than yours, but the content will be pretty much the same, and I'll be using the 1984, the NIV. And note again the heading, Paul's chains advance the gospel. Now, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. Because of my chains, most of the brothers in the Lord have been encouraged to speak the word of God more courageously and fearlessly. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do it in love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached, and because of this I rejoice. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help given by the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but I have sufficient courage so that now, as always, Christ may be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet what shall I choose? I do not know. I am torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far, but it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain, and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that through my being with you again, your joy in Jesus Christ will overflow on account of me. Whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then, whether I come and see you or only hear about you in my absence, I will know you stand firm in one spirit, contending as one man for the faith of the gospel, without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you. This is a sign to them that they will be destroyed, but that you will be saved, and that by God. For it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him, since you are going through the same struggle you saw I had, and now hear that I still have. All right, it's a long section, and we would need several hours to go by it, sentence by sentence, word for word. So the plan here is just to basically get a general grasp of what's going on in the whole passage, and then consider more closely key verses and anything that might need a little more explanation, like verse 21. We definitely want to talk about verse 21. And along that line, I might add that when we work through a book of the Bible here, I often, as you know, don't take time to point out, dozens of ways of how we can apply the points being made. I'm assuming that the applications will be pretty obvious to everyone, and I'm aware of the fact that different points will resonate with different people differently. So just encourage each of us to look for ways in which the truths of this section and of this letter are relevant to your own lives and situation. Fair enough? All right, good. So Paul begins this section by speaking candidly about his current situation. He is being held in confinement, and he goes on to tell them of how this incarceration is causing mixed reactions in the wider church. Rather than give details of his hardship, complaining about his loss of freedom and the conditions that he is having to endure and all of that, he instead expresses joy that his imprisonment is causing the gospel to go forward. The believers at Philippi, his friends, were obviously concerned about him, and that is why they sent Epaphroditus. And no doubt they saw his imprisonment and his impending trial as a huge setback. Like, oh no, now what? And they had been quite worried for both him and also for the mission at hand, that of taking the gospel to the Gentiles. This seemed to be a major problem here. And so Paul's response is probably not what they were expecting, where he says the mission has not been hindered, rather it is advancing in a way that we would not have imagined. So he then describes three ways in which this has happened. First, as he notes, the word is going out among the palace guard and beyond that he is no ordinary prisoner, there in verse 13. My situation's quite unusual, and so I'm the talk of the town. Who would have guessed? As a result, I've been given considerable opportunities to explain why I am in chains. Many are intrigued, fascinated, eager to learn more about this Christ whom I serve and suffer for. Now, Paul may have been bound in chains, but the gospel, on the other hand, had enjoyed remarkable freedom and is spreading about quite liberally and without restraint. The gospel is unchained. Secondly, verse 14, the gospel has been advanced because Paul's example of suffering for Christ has emboldened others. Those who were once timid have now become far less so. And examples of courage, of course, inspire all of us to step it up. Thirdly, because of his imprisonment, Paul finds encouragement in the fact that the gospel has advanced strangely enough through the preaching of his rivals. Again, we don't have a good grasp of what's behind all of this, but apparently there are those who are wanting to stir things up to make it worse for Paul. Maybe they were jealous of Paul's popularity. Maybe they envied his standing that he enjoyed with the apostles or the fruitfulness of his ministry, whatever. And so if the gospel message was offensive to some of the Roman authorities, then perhaps it would cause them to come down even harder on Paul and maybe even influence the outcome of his impending trial. So that's what's going on there. But from Paul's point of view, if what they are saying is true, then so be it. And his exact words, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. As we move into the last part of verse 18, Paul turns his attention to the future. He not only rejoices to see God at work in his present circumstances to advance the gospel, but he will continue to rejoice in God's faithfulness in whatever awaits him. On one level, the future is uncertain. This trial is hanging over his head. The outcome could be anything from acquittal and freedom to death. On another level, the future is very certain, entirely certain. He knows that whether by life or death, to use his words, Christ will be exalted. Either way, acquittal or execution, he will not, while he waits, be deprived of joy. Verses 19 and 25, however, indicate that he is pretty optimistic that he will be released. He is hopeful about seeing the Philippians soon, this so that he can help them progress in the faith and to continue the mission of spreading the great news about Jesus to the Gentiles. But yet, as he knows, the matter is completely out of his hands. It's ultimately the will of the Lord. And in his own mind, he resolves this agonizing tension between life and death by committing himself to serve to the end. And his words here deserve some careful attention. So we'll pick it up there, starting halfway through verse 20. So that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. And these next words, very familiar, for to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. We all know those words, right? Heard them lots of times. Now, when you think about it, it would seem that normally we would tend to say it just the opposite. We are naturally wired to think to live is gain and to die is Christ. You know, I am suffering a life-threatening sickness or injury. It is a great advantage, great profit for me to pull through and to survive it. To live is gain. If, on the other hand, I die, then I go to be with the Lord. Thus, to die is Christ. Yet, as you see, this is not what Paul says. And the difference here is worth noting. In fact, his words, to live is Christ, are magnified by the statement, to die is gain. So let's see if we can follow the point he is making here. We often find Paul often spoke of Christ as his life, and we often find statements like that in some of his other letters. Essentially, what this means is that he so wanted to glorify Christ that everything he would do would be done with that main objective, that goal in mind. Everything, every day, for the rest of his life, right up to his last breath, would be to please the Lord and fulfill his will. Take, for instance, Galatians 2:20. I have been crucified with Christ. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. And in our letter here, that particular conviction is accomplished, at least in part, by his chains in prison. And if the verdict at his trial is the worst case scenario, guilty and sentenced to death, though that death will prevent him from spreading the gospel to the Gentiles and keep him from helping the Philippians progress in the faith, it will still be a gain, at least in some sense, for he will be with the Lord in a more intimate way. All right, now, very important. He does not welcome death in this scenario because it will free him from a miserable life in this miserable world, trapped in a miserable body. He says nothing to that effect at all. Nothing to suggest that he is tired of the battle, tired of the suffering, and is ready to get relief from it all. Rather, and very important, he welcomes the possibility of death for this reason. He will be with the Lord. I mean, that's what he says. However, big however, he is not exactly painting that picture in an overly glorious way. He actually dampens it a little bit, if you will, by lamenting the fact that there will be a major disadvantage if he does die, which is what he says next in verse 22. If I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. And it is more necessary, and in verse 20, what he says in verse 22, if I go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. The implication is that will stop. Verse 24, it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. Verse 25, I will continue with all of you for your progress and join the faith. And so you can see here there's this tension. There's something to be gained, there's something to be lost. Christians tend to pull out verse 21, but they need to keep reading because verse 21 is not the whole picture. And very important, there is more going on here than what would be gained by Paul's death, than him being with the Lord. So we need to dig into that because it is worth digging into. First, we need to realize that in our English translations, they do not capture the rhetorical power of these words because there are no verbs in the original language. And so translators take the liberty to fill them in, but it is more accurate to read it like this: to live, Christ; to die, gain. The rhythm is both striking and it's intentional. Paul didn't forget to include the verbs. He left them out on purpose. Now, there are different ways we could fill it in. In fact, different translations have tried to do that. To live is Christ, traditional translation. It could also be translated, or to live means Christ, or to live depends on Christ, or to live honors Christ, or to live is all about Christ. All are true, but none capture really the whole point. The obvious point Paul is making here is that his foundation, purpose, direction, power, and meaning of life, everything is Christ. Since Christ is the goal of life, the goal of everything, dying is a gain if it is a way of bearing witness to Christ. Right? Let me repeat that. Since Christ is the goal of life, dying is gain if it is a way of bearing witness to Christ. So, very important, verse 20 informs the way we are to understand verse 21. Paul says that Christ will be exalted in him, whether by life or death. This means that the words to die as gain is not referring exclusively to what Paul himself would gain in his death, as in enjoying a state of bliss in heaven, but to what the gospel of Christ would gain, namely the advancement of Christ's gospel that would result from his martyrdom. If his imprisonment has expanded the message of Christ's kingdom, then how much more so would his death? You know, this is a typical lesser to greater argument. And as we know from church history, this is exactly what often happens. The famous quote from the second and third century persecutions, where Tertullian argues with the emperors, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Though Paul's letter is not a manual of martyrdom or promoting martyrdom, his words here have provided encouragement and inspiration for many facing a martyr's death. For us, who are not yet facing such threats, the main takeaway is that these popular words, to die as gain, are to be understood in their context. In fact, it is safe to say that there should be two gains or benefits to any believer's death. Yes, they will be with the Lord. That is a gain, but also, and a very big also, is the death itself should serve to honor the Lord, or at least in some way advance the gospel. And this is especially true if the death is that of martyrdom. But martyrdom isn't the only way to glorify Christ when facing the prospect of death. And the issue here isn't really, again, I think you can see this, not really the death itself, but one's example in the face of death. Obvious examples would include remaining resolved and believing God's promises about eternity and doing so to the bitter end. And not blaming God for one's dire situation, but expressing joy in what lies ahead and faith in that. Giving God credit for the countless blessings that have been enjoyed through the many years of life that God has given, instead of focusing on the misery that it's about to end. Treating others with kindness and respect and a spirit of humility, even while dealing with pain and misery and the acute awareness of one's impending fatality. Examining one's life and making every effort to right all wrongs, making peace with enemies, repenting of past sins, coming clean. These sorts of things. The list goes on. Choosing, for instance, to be buried. I've talked about this before, testifying to one's belief in the future resurrection of that body, then destroying it in cremation. I will do a sermon on that one day, but I'll wait till Josh is in charge so he can, clean up the mess that I make from that. The point is, the attitude in verse 20 is one every one of us should adopt. Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. That's what casts its shadow up on verse 21. Again, since Christ is the goal of life, dying is gain if it is a way of bearing witness to Christ. All right, let's move on now to verses 24 and 25. A quick observation. After explaining his attitude about the possibility of death, he conveys a certain expectation, even conviction, that he will be set free. And last week I pointed out his words, the words there from verse 4 about praying in joy. Here in verse 25, we have joy in the faith, another interesting expression. Pray in joy was interesting. Joy in the faith is another one of these. And these phrases, they're kind of easy to overlook, but they're common in this letter. And some form of the words joy or rejoice occur in this letter 16 times. All right, moving on to the last paragraph, verses 27 to 30. I love the opening of the words here. Whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. The whatever happens is, of course, referring to the outcome of his impending trial in the Roman court. But the exhortation here is quite a mission statement. They truly capture the meaning of to live as Christ. And we find similar exhortations in some of Paul's other letters. Romans, Colossians, Ephesians, both of his letters to the Thessalonians have language like this. For instance, to the Ephesians, he tells you, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Now, just kind of on a side note here, on a personal note, I have often used these words here in my own prayers over the years. After confessing sins and asking the Lord to help me overcome certain troublesome traits, this exhortation here from Paul seems to be a fitting way to ask for God's help. Help me to conduct myself in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. And I think that really helps to kind of frame things, especially if it's prayed early in the day. You can kind of remember that prayer throughout the times of weaknesses and temptation throughout the day. I started the day asking the Lord to help me to be a good witness, to conduct myself in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, and this thing that's now enticing would not be so. These sorts of things are easy to desire during one's prayers. They're not so easy to desire when certain situations come up. This exhortation here in verse 27, however, it does set everything up for what follows, the rest of this chapter, and really all of chapter 2. In the next verses, we see that the believers are facing opposition that results in suffering. We don't know the details here, but it's clear that persecution is involved. And so he begins here by exhorting them to remain steadfast, to stand together. And in this, Paul compares his own struggle with the Romans to their own. And his words here seem to draw from the teachings of Jesus, who promised that all who follow him will suffer opposition and hardship. And that persecution really is a cause for blessing and rejoicing, something that we tend to forget but have to be reminded of over and over. There in verse 27, the word stand, it's a military metaphor. It provides a picture of resisting an approaching army, of holding the fort. Soldiers will be able to do that if they work together as a unit, a team, and this is what Paul is calling his readers to do, to stand firm in one spirit, contending as one man for the faith of the gospel. Opposition is to be expected. That opposition will never be easy or pleasant, but it can be endured when believers support each other during it and stand together. You know, we've talked about this in the past, but yet it's just another reason why every Christian should be plugged into a church body. Because when things go down, a churchless Christian who stands alone isn't going to have much of a chance. And that's another sermon that I want to give, this business about Christians not committing to a local church. I've already given it a couple dozen times here, and folks don't really need it, but sometimes you just have to get a microphone, stand on a soapbox, and say it one more time. And I'll probably wait until the new regime takes over before I give that one too. So anyway, do you like the chosen word regime? Was that a good word? All right, back to the subject of suffering for the faith. What we see here in verse 29 is Paul presenting it not as just something to endure, but really as a privilege to be treasured. In a strange kind of way, suffering for Jesus is a gift. Note again the wording. For it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ to not only believe on him, but also to suffer for him. Both are gifts, believing in and suffering for, believing in Christ and suffering for him. And on this, we might think of the apostles back in Acts 5, where they were flogged for proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus. And afterwards, it is said that when they left, they were rejoicing because they had been counted worthy to suffer disgrace for the name. In both believing and suffering, Christ is the source and the center of life. We need to remember that suffering in general comes from living in a fallen world, a world suffering from the effects of sin. Yet Christians, because of their identification with righteousness in a world that is hostile to righteousness, will suffer a unique kind of suffering, an additional kind of suffering. And this suffering, as Jesus stated in the Beatitudes, is a divinely given privilege, a blessing. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. As we follow Paul's train of thought through the whole section, one thing we can say for certain, suffering for righteousness is a way to not only advance the gospel itself, but also as a way for Christ to be glorified. And we could sum this up with the point he made back in verse 20. So that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in me, whether by life or by suffering or by death itself. And Paul closes the paragraph by connecting his suffering and the fruit that it bears to theirs, with the expectation that their persecution in Philippi will also bear fruit for the advancement of Christ's good news. He tells them that their suffering and his are part of the same struggle to advance the same cause. He may be suffering more intensely and the threat to his life greater, but in the end, whoever takes a stand for Christ is honoring the Lord just the same. And if you or I suffer for the cause of Christ, we share with them as well. And for that matter, for all the saints through all of history. Their struggle is our struggle, all for the glory of God. So just as Paul was more concerned about his advancement of the gospel than about his sufferings and incarceration, and just as he was more concerned about Christ being preached than the malicious motives of those who preached it, and just as he was more concerned about Christ being magnified than whether he lived or died, so the Philippian Christians should concern themselves more with the conduct that is worthy of the gospel than with cowering back to the threats of others. And, of course, so should we. So, as we get ready to look at the next passage the next time, if we could title verses 27 through 30 as Standing United Against the Opposition from the Outside, then the next verses, 1 through 4 of chapter 2, could be titled Standing Against Dissension from Within. And that's where we'll pick it up next Sunday. And so I would just encourage you to read ahead. And this time we'll have the musicians come forward. We're going to close with the song For All the Saints, and then we'll be dismissed.